Welcome to the Round 10 World Chess Championship review between Ding Liren with white and Gukesh Namaraju with black. Let's dive right in. Well, after a brief pause after the round had started, Ding played d4 and he later clarified he'd just been settling himself in, given that what he was playing was very similar to Gukesh's moves with white. So after d4, knight f6, remaining flexible, as in previous lines. Ding briefly didn't play Bishop f4, London, but thereafter clarified that Bishop f4, the London system, was what he was going for. And e6, very safe and sturdy here, making a pawn chain, developing the bishop somewhere. e7 or d6, challenging this bishop, all very safe and sturdy. And there followed e3, very symmetrical. c5, striking back, and this is where, in previous round, Ding had played c3 and gone for the bishop b5 check line. That led to some structural quandaries over the possibly weak pawns on the c-file and a knight versus bishop scenario. However, Ding had clearly come with a new plan, which was bishop e2, diverging from the bishop b5 check and also not committing with c3, which perhaps gives c4 options and so on and so forth. There followed, well, bishop d6, challenging London bishop, makes a lot of sense. And now Ding's point, d takes c5. Black does have the option of capturing on f4. They do, after captures back, win the a5 pawn. For example, c3, queen takes c5. It's doing a whole different game. White's pawn structure is doubled, but some pawns don't have to be bad. In fact, they can be very good, defending central squares, opening files in their absence, and this would be one of those moments where White would be very good here, very happy at least, and whilst the game could continue with the queen retreating and both sides castling, Gukesh decided not to go into it. He instead captured on c5, and there followed Ding's point. c4, striking back at the centre. It's worth noting, yes, black has two central pawns, white's one, but with the c-pawn immediately happening here, they will either capture, and obviously that's 1v1, or be captured, and that reduces the central pawns. So very good counter-strike by Ding, with the idea being to try and imbalance things and keep things flexible in the centre. Castle's kingside, and knight c6, knight c3. So both sides not blinking. The entire time this moment, there has been d takes c4, which would have opened the queens up, possibly to trades. But the issue in those moments is that the rooks, for whoever blinks first, perhaps the rooks come in and dominate. And meanwhile, the whole premise of this line is that this bishop is a little bit backwards, unable to get out too comfortably. Meanwhile, this bishop is, of course, that much better and developed. And it's notable now that Ding Liren's second, Richard Report, a very creative player who comes up with fascinating opening ideas, and indeed throughout the whole game, he has seen this position where, for example, playing Sam Shankland, saw that rook c1 and then d4. And the main idea is, having played rook c1, black shuts down the c-file, keeps pieces on. Of course, it's still now 3 versus 2 and going to be 4 versus just 3 once these liquidate off. And for that reason, after pawn takes, knight takes, bishop e5, well, it's an imbalanced game still. This could have been seen. Perhaps this was Ding's hope that Gukesh would bite and play pawn d4, try and keep the pieces on. Because, of course, that has been Gukesh's mantra in the past few rounds, to keep pieces on and try for dynamic ideas. Unfortunately, perhaps, instead of this, after knight c3, liquidation occurred in the centre, where, well, white captured back. And the difference here is, of course, it's very symmetrical. 2 pawns on the queen side each, 4 pawns, so 2 pawn islands. Very symmetrical, very sturdy. The difference, once again, is this bishop versus this bishop. Of course, white has the slightly better of it in all. For example, if queen takes d1, rook f takes d1, the sheer time it takes to play b6, bishop b7, for example, if we do that now, gives white chances to attempt things like knight d2, not present in all positions, but here, knight to e4, starts to potentially double pawns, jump to here, it also hits the bishop, of course. So the time it takes to play b6 and catch up with bishop b7 maybe gives white something to strike at. This is still roughly level, but maybe a good version of all potential queen trades. So instead, after bishop takes c4, both sides notably only using 5, or indeed in Ding's case 10 minutes on his clock. Gukesh now spent about half an hour, just under, and played knight to h5, striking at the bishop. Clearly trying to think, okay, well, I don't want to, as we just saw, go into these things where white has all the fun. I can hold a draw, be what Gukesh's thoughts were, but there's no need to get into that, into such a committed position. So knight h5, keeping pieces on, keeping dynamic play, very sensible decision. Ding now also started to think. And after about 25 minutes, played a bishop to g5, striking at the queen. The dilemma is, of course, Ding does not want to lose this bishop, and, well, the computer perhaps points out knight e4 and goes into some interesting counter-strike. For example, knight e4. There follows knight takes bishop. Well, a bit of a crazy line that ends up like so, where after everything trades off, we once again see these doubled pawns. Perhaps it's slightly imbalanced still with a potentially weak c5 pawn, but with the rook having an open file, it's hard to believe white can be aiming for a win here. Definitely they can try, keep the rook on in the center, but ultimately the rook will gain activity and it will be very tough to defend all these weaknesses whilst also attacking these. Black will move their king to e7, and yeah, basically a very level position. For that reason, bishop g5 was played by Ding, and there followed bishop retreat, just sensibly keeping things solid, not trying to push a boat out anymore. If they were to try moving for one thing, where does their queen go? b6 allows various knight a4 issues, which if you can start winning the bishop pair would be very pleasant in this position. Of course, if bishop to a queen even to c7, there's a bunch of bishop f4s in the long run. This knight can't stay here forever. It is at the end of an x-ray. And so moving the queen, short of trading the queens, which again would finish on white's terms, very playable. For example, h6 can now happen and black's gained the move. But nonetheless, Gukesh was not the first to blink. He indeed played bishop to e7. Knight to e4, very sensible move, as we've just seen in some variations, very useful, defending. Knight to f6, once again, neither side blinking here. Knight takes f6, bishop takes, and now there's a hint of an imbalance, where after rook takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, black has doubled pawns, but they've developed their rook. Nonetheless, this bishop is still slightly inferior to this, and arguably this knight is not the best either compared to this knight on f3. So rook fd1, challenging the open file. If black were to capture, well, it's always a shame to give up your one rook that's doing things. Definitely the king can come and watch this, but this is potentially a weakness in the long run. So if the king does wander over here too early, black has to be a little bit careful. There is f5 right now, but these are all things that both players would have been aware of in terms of the trade-offs. For that reason, rather than give white a rook on open file, black, Gukesh, played bishop d7, getting ready to just connect the rooks, retreat to e8, very sensible approach. At this point, both players would have been very much aware that in about 10 moves' time, things will likely be trading off if nothing changes. And let's see if that happened. Rook c1, bishop e8, and the rooks traded. The king walked over to the center, getting Ding ready for the oncoming endgame, where the king certainly is helpful, covering the d-file for obvious reasons. And king g7, also marching the king up. It's worth noting this bishop perhaps isn't so happy with the pawn structure. It is technically a bad bishop, but with this king likely coming in a few moments after the addition of f5, then that compensates somewhat. The pawns, of course, block this bishop, and this bishop can bounce back to c6 in the long run, as we'll see later on. There followed a3, preventing knight to jump into here, perhaps. Also giving the bishop some hope, maybe even hinting at b4, b5 things, although I would say that would potentially overstretch and leave a weakness from potential rook d3s and so on. kind of forces the bishop to babysit the d3 pawn. So b4, potentially a risky addition. There followed f5, locking down on this diagonal, and hoping for this king to now be more mobile. King e1, just keeping off of any funny business with a check in some variations. Just makes a lot of sense to keep it on dark square rather than light square. There's not necessarily a benefit to king e2. So the dark square makes some thematic sense, avoiding any funny business. King f6, marching on, also on dark squares, covering all the entry points for the knight, which wouldn't be able to do too much anyway, but just locking down prophylactically almost in advance of any hopping forwards. Bishop e2 retreating, opening up for the rook, and there happened with knight e7, covering a bunch of squares, hoping to hop to here. But most importantly, if the rooks can come off, then we're one step closer to a draw, would very much have been on both players' minds. And g3, improving the structure, controlling the dark squares. Rook c8, the main idea, essentially hidden idea by knight e7. It was coming forwards, but it was also doing this, where it will then come forwards yet again and attack some squares in the center. Of course, white can't really decline. There's too many issues, and after a3 earlier, we've weakened the dark leg squares even, with this bishop coming to here. Various issues that would happen. Of course, if the king walks up, the rook trade anyway, so at least undevelop the knight a tiny bit, although it's coming back out. Knight d2, knight to d6, and after knight c4, I think both players had had enough. At this moment, very likely in any other format, they would have offered a draw, but of course no draws before move 40, other than a threefold repetition. And the point is, with the same coloured bishops, now the rooks and knight have traded off, well, there would follow, as happened, both sides constructing pawn structures, activating their bishops and kings. This bishop, which was for the whole game a bit grotty and trapped, has now come to c6, clearly very active. No targets from the earlier useful moves, but the point is now, after f4, locking down the structure. As we'll see, the structures are constructed, and then here we have it. In red, all of the no-go zones for black, so there's no entry points for white, and likewise the same in blue can be seen for black. Meanwhile, both sides can place a bishop to just cover any potential infiltrations on the other rank, flank even, of the board. And on the h file, there's no entry. The h pawn can even go to h6 just to support. In other words, there's a huge blockade. That's exactly what happened. King entered the center, h6, and both players really had enough at this moment. A threefold repetition occurred on the board, and a draw was agreed. So a peaceful result, of course, where both players are not unhappy. Black, Gukesh, has drawn with the black pieces and was very happy with that, of course. Relatively simple draw, although there were some moments Gukesh had to think to avoid going into some worse versions of what could have happened. As we saw, he navigated his way very thoroughly. Ding Liren, on the other hand, clearly aiming for rapid and blitz tie breaks, where he may well be favoured in that format in a few days' time. There's 4 rounds, of course, after this game. The downside, of course, for Ding is that he will have to face Gukesh's penultimate white game tomorrow, which could mean that he may well be punished for agreeing such an easy draw in this game today. However, that remains to be seen, and well, do stay tuned. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and tune in again tomorrow for another game review of round 11. All the best. Cheers.